Good evening, I'm Elizabeth Farnsworth. Jim Lehrer is on vacation. On the NewsHour tonight, the latest on the U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. From a reporter in Nairobi, the State Department's Susan Rice and 3 experts. Also, the long, hot Texas summer. And the week's politics with Paul Gigot and Tom Oliphant filling in for Mark Shields. It all follows our summary of the news this Friday.
Brought to you in part by ADM. Feeding the world is the biggest challenge of the new century. Outside the U.S., you'll find 96% of the world's population. Inside, you'll find the means to feed them. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by Solomon Smith Barney.
Could roses eventually cost a dime a dozen? One thing's for sure, opportunities abound. Let's get to work. Solomon Smith Barney.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
2 bombs exploded almost simultaneously today at the U.S. embassies in the East African nations of Kenya and Tanzania. The blasts occurred about 4 minutes and 450 miles apart in the capital cities of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. 74 people were killed in Nairobi, 8 of them Americans. 6 Americans are still missing. More than 1,600 people were injured. Rescue workers and volunteers dug through concrete rubble to pull survivors and bodies from the wreckage. An Army sergeant from Missouri, Kenneth R. Hobson II, was the first victim identified. In Dar es Salaam, 7 people, none of them American, were killed by the explosion, which some described as a car bomb. 72 people were injured. U.S. Marines who guard all embassies tried to keep order while firefighters doused flames. In Washington, President Clinton condemned the attacks at a White House Rose Garden event.
These acts of terrorist violence are abhorrent. They are inhuman. We will use all the means at our disposal to bring those responsible to justice, no matter what or how long it takes. And we will do everything we can to assure that you can serve in safety. To the families and loved ones of the American and African victims of these cowardly attacks, you are in our thoughts and prayers.
Mr. Clinton ordered flags flown at half-staff. He said U.S. military, medical teams, and anti-terrorist investigators were being dispatched to the 2 countries. American embassies around the world were put on increased security alerts. No one has claimed responsibility for the bombings. We'll have much more on the story right after the news summary. And back in this country, in Washington today, the federal judge overseeing the Monica Lewinsky grand jury ruled that independent counsel Kenneth Starr must answer for news leaks. The judge said lawyers for President Clinton provided evidence of violations of grand jury secrecy, and that Starr must explain at a hearing how details of testimony wound up in the media. Starr has strongly denied that he or his staff were the source of such leaks. A White House spokesman said he welcomed today's ruling. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to the U.S. Embassy bombings in Africa, the long, hot Texas summer, and the week's politics with Gigot and Oliphant. First tonight, the explosions that ripped apart U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. We begin with the latest from Nairobi. Kwame Holman spoke a short while ago with Time Magazine's stringer Clive Mutiso, who is Kenyan.
Clive Mutiso, thank you for joining us from Nairobi. Clive, where were you this morning and what did you see and hear?
I was about 3/4 of a mile from the embassy when I felt what seemed like an earth tremor, a strong earth tremor. And then a couple of seconds after that, there was a thunderclap noise, just like an atmospherical thunderclap, and a shockwave. And I looked in the direction of the United States Embassy, which it had come from, and I saw turbulence in the air up to a height of about 500 feet. Clean turbulence, the sort of turbulence you would get from a large quantity of plastic explosive. And so I ran toward the embassy, reached the scene after maybe 7 or 8 minutes, and found total devastation. The car park at the back of the embassy on the south side was a sea of flames caused by the explosion ripping apart the fuel tanks of vehicles in the car park, which then ignited and set fire to the tarmac of the car park and the road. The 5-story embassy building was utterly devastated. It was built, if I recall, 15, 16 years ago and designed to be bomb-proof. And certainly the structure was not much damaged, but the interior of the building was completely gutted. The explosion had torn out all of the windows and ripped out the false ceilings and heaped the furniture in piles of wreckage in corners of the rooms. You could see right into all of the rooms of the embassy. And the scene was totally horrific. I saw at least 8 bodies carried out of the embassy itself, although I believe that there were as many as 30 people killed instantaneously in the embassy. There was a 7-story commercial building right next door which totally collapsed, trapping very many people inside. And everything within a quarter-mile radius of the embassy, every building was very extensively damaged. I saw at least 20 bodies in the immediate vicinity, and I now understand that there could be as many as 100 people lying dead in mortuaries around the city. There are certainly 1,200 people with horrendous, serious injuries admitted to these hospitals, and the emergency services are struggling to keep up with the workload.
Clive, in some of the pictures we've seen thus far, that mound of rubble you say was the 7-story building adjacent to the embassy. We see people on that debris and people waving from the ground and people being brought out. Did you witness some of that?
I did, yes. That building was called Ofundi Cooperative House, and it was reduced to something like 1/4 of its original height. There were massive blocks of 5 and 10 tons of reinforced concrete which were trapping the people inside. Immediately after the explosion, it wasn't possible to get near it to try to assist people because it was all unstable. And so it was necessary to bring in 4 40-ton mobile cranes. One was stationed at each corner of the wreckage and began gingerly lifting away the wreckage and trying to clear the way to the survivors inside. But in many cases, there were dead bodies which were pulled out. Something like 30 dead bodies were pulled out.
Clive, we have also seen some pictures. We also have seen some pictures from later today when it's night in Nairobi, as it is now still, although it may be moving toward morning now. What has been going on through the night in Nairobi?
I was at the scene after nightfall, and it was quite eerie. For 3 or 4 blocks around the embassy, the devastated buildings were in total darkness. They were being guarded by police and troops in light combat gear because the explosion ripped away glass walls and curtain walls and left them open to the outside streets, and so they were being guarded. The embassy itself was bathed in an eerie yellowish, orange, temporary floodlighting. But I got the impression that although they may still have been searching inside the embassy building, at the collapsed building next door, they had already given up hope of finding anybody alive.
Clive, let me ask you, at the beginning you said that the turbulence in the air looked to you like what would be the result of a plastic explosive. You had experience in the Kenyan military reserves. What else can you say about your belief that a plastic explosive may have been involved?
The devastation was almost indescribable. My estimate is that this must have been something like 500 kilograms of plastic explosive. We're not talking about a crude bomb here. This was a very sophisticated device. The United States Embassy, which is temporarily relocated to the US 8 building out of town, are still reluctant to attribute this to a bomb because, frankly, I don't think they yet have the capability on site to get the forensic confirmation that this is a bomb. But in my mind, this was a large quantity of plastic explosive.
Clive, finally, what can you tell us about, you said some 1,200 people probably injured. What is the condition at this hour of the hospitals, the medical services trying to take care of those people?
There are 1,200 people most certainly injured, that they are admitted to these hospitals, but they're just the most serious cases. And doctors, nurses, volunteer paramedics have poured into the hospitals to try to do what they can to cope with the incredible rush. One of the biggest constraints at the moment is lack of blood. So many of these people have lost a lot of blood in cut injuries caused by shards of flying glass, and so there's still a desperate need for blood donors of all groups.
Clive Mutiso in downtown Nairobi, thank you very much for being with us.
For more on that story and on the bombing in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, we are joined now by Susan Rice, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Thank you for being with us. Could you bring us up to date and give us the most recent casualty figures, since we're getting different figures from different sources for both embassies, both cities?
Yes, Elizabeth. Our information is most accurate as it pertains to American citizens and those employed by our embassies. The latest information from Nairobi is that 8 official Americans have been killed. There are another 6 who are missing and unaccounted for, and approximately 14 who are in hospital receiving treatment. Some of them are quite seriously injured. We have many other who have been injured, many other casualties, including a number of the Kenyan Foreign Service nationals who work in our embassy. The death toll among that group and among the Kenyan population is something that we are still all awaiting further information on. In Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, no Americans were killed, and we have no reason to believe that that we'll get different information on that at this stage. A number were seriously injured. One was medevaced out of the country, and we did unfortunately lose 5 Tanzanians who were employed by our embassy.
We just heard that graphic report from Clive Mutiso. Can you tell us what you're hearing from Dar es Salaam? He was talking about Nairobi.
Well, I think the situation in Dar es Salaam is a little bit less chaotic and grave than it appears to be in Nairobi. The blast was quite severe. It did major structural damage to our embassy as well as to surrounding facilities. There were, as I mentioned, a number killed as well as a number seriously injured, but the numbers appear to be on a much smaller scale than is the case in Kenya.
Can you tell us anything about the explosives? Do you know what they were? Will you say that these were bombs?
At this stage, Elizabeth, we have to say that that's a law enforcement matter for investigation. We will look forward to the evidence and the forensics giving us clear word on that.
Did you have any warnings?
We had no telephone warning or call of any sort like that that might have alerted either embassy just prior to the blast. And beyond that, as we go through the investigation, we'll look for other information that might have been helpful.
Have you gotten any calls, any information from groups claiming responsibility?
We have not. The U.S. government has not gotten any calls directly. A Cairo-based newspaper has received one claim. We have no further information at this stage, no reason to assume that it's credible.
Who was the group that claimed responsibility there?
I don't have the name handy.
Okay.
It was not a well-known group.
As you know, there were news reports saying that a banned Egyptian group who was upset over the extradition of some of their members from Albania, which the U.S. apparently had a hand in, had threatened American installations, I think this week. Any credibility in that?
I can't comment on the specifics of that threat, but let me say that we receive threats, I'm told as many as 30,000 a year to our facilities around the world. They're all taken seriously. They're all investigated. But we have nothing to suggest any direct link to what has happened today. As I said, again, that's going to be a question for the investigators to look into.
Assistant Secretary Rice, what kind of American help, official help, is on its way right now?
We have a great deal of assistance on the way to help both our American citizens on the ground as well as the Kenyan and Tanzanian citizens who have suffered so gravely in this tragedy. That help falls into a variety of categories. We have planes in the air transporting medical equipment, supplies, and personnel. We have law enforcement teams on the way to begin the process of investigation. We will be bringing in all sorts of various equipment and experts who can help in the search and rescue effort and do our utmost to render the services to the individuals who are injured and otherwise in danger.
At this point, do you have any idea why those embassies were chosen?
No, we have no idea why terrorists pick the targets that they do. That is something that perhaps we'll learn in the course of the investigation.
Were they particularly easy to get to, these embassies? One report, I don't know if it was right, said that the explosion occurred in the parking lot of the embassy in Tanzania. Is that true?
I think it's too soon to know exactly where the explosives might have been placed. Obviously, they were quite proximate to both our embassy compounds, and that's the large reason why they did such a great deal of the damage.
Were either of these embassies particularly vulnerable because they had not been upgraded to be more impervious to bombing?
Well, these embassies, like a number of our facilities around the world, which have been built many years back, do not have the same degree of security in place that would be the case were it to be a new embassy built today. And as a consequence, the facilities that we're talking about in both these places were not state-of-the-art facilities.
And what instructions are being issued now to other embassies?
All of our embassies around the world have received warning of this, notice of this, and are taking appropriate precautions. We maintain a high degree of security at all of our embassies at all times, and obviously that high degree of security has been increased even further as a result of this information.
In what way?
Well, I don't want to get into the specifics of that. As you can imagine, that may be more useful to people who have unhelpful motives.
Okay, Madam Assistant Secretary, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And now 3 more views on all this from Jack McGeorge, a former Secret Service security and munitions expert and now president of a security consulting firm. Larry Johnson, a former counterterrorism specialist at the State Department and now a security consultant. And Solly Booker, senior fellow and director of the Africa Studies program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was at the embassy in Nairobi last month. Larry Johnson, can you draw any preliminary conclusions from what you've heard, the reports that you've read, the report we just heard from Nairobi, and from the Assistant Secretary's report?
Let me put it this way. If I was running around saying I'm going to kill somebody, and that somebody shows up dead a few days or a month later, police would be at my doorstep asking me, where were you and what were you doing? And in this case, we have one individual. This is not reflexive to say we pin this individual, but twice this year, Osama bin Laden has issued a fatwa calling upon Islamics around the world to target and kill American citizens. Now, fortunately, the vast majority of Islamic citizens do not respond to that kind of call and find it abhorrent. But Mr. bin Laden, unfortunately, was in Sudan. He used it as a terrorist base of operations. Sudan, as you may know, is adjacent to Kenya. And Sudan gave Osama support and continues to support some other terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Abu Nidal. So the list of possible suspects starts there. Now, ultimately, who was responsible will be determined by the evidence that's collected on the ground, not by speculation at the outset.
Do you think it's too early to speculate about this sort of thing?
Absolutely. I totally agree with Larry. At this stage, we know a very large bomb went off in both places. A lot of people died. The who did it, that will depend on the evidence that emerges, claims that are made and such. I certainly believe that, as Larry pointed out, certain individuals have made threats like this. Bin Laden is certainly an example of one, and he's certainly someone to look at. But by no means should we conclude at this stage that's who did it.
Right. Mr. McGeorge, what can you conclude about the explosive from what you've heard?
It was really big. I don't want to trivialize that, but at this stage, that's all we know.
How about, excuse me for interrupting, but what about what Clive Matiso said, that it was also very sophisticated?
I see no evidence of that. Most car bombs are not very sophisticated. They're just big.
You think it was a car bomb?
I think it was a car bomb because you have to get that much explosive. The explosive was, looking at the video, was not inside the building, it was outside the building. You have to get that much explosive there by some means. A car is a logical means. It may turn out to be otherwise, but I'd be very surprised if it does. I suspect very strongly it's a car bomb. I would agree with his estimate of the 500 kilogram range. That will depend a bit on what we find out it actually is. Whether it's plastic explosive or not, that, believe me, there is no evidence from what we see that would support that conclusion at this time. I don't see anything that would support that. What we could say is there was a lot of explosive, possibly more in the bomb in Kenya than it was in Tanzania, but that is not clear. There may also have been a third car. I noticed that that has been referenced several times today, and just looking at the nature of the damage to our embassy in Kenya, it would not shock me that we might find that that's the case.
Do you have any conclusions from looking at the reports and seeing the pictures of the bombings?
To my knowledge, in the last 30 years of covering international terrorist incidents, there are only two groups which have demonstrated the capability to pull off two simultaneous explosions like this. One is Hezbollah, and the other one is the IRA. I really don't see the IRA being involved. Hezbollah is another group you have to look at, but this was a sophisticated operation. This wasn't cobbled together in the last few days, and the amount of explosives, as Jack rightly notes, was probably more in a truck of some sort or a delivery vehicle as opposed to, say, a small compact sedan. So you're looking at someone who planned this operation and did it deliberately and pulled it off within a 4-minute time period. Suggests a sophistication that it's someone who's experienced and organized.
Sally Booker, you know these embassies. Describe the security around them, beginning with Nairobi.
In terms of the physical security of the buildings themselves, they're fairly well fortified. Dr. Rice mentioned they're not state-of-the-art. The one in Nairobi has been constructed, however, since the 79 hostage takings in Iran, which led to the fortification of a number of American embassies around the world, a raising of standards of construction as far as security is concerned. As you can see, the building in Nairobi itself remains intact. It was largely the glass that was blown out everywhere, whereas the buildings surrounding the American embassy, some of them were demolished altogether. In the case of Tanzania, it was an older embassy. Security was improved on the perimeter, but the parking area, as I understand, is on that perimeter, and thus a car bomb could get close enough to cause extensive damage.
And the Nairobi embassy is right downtown, a very busy intersection,
That's right. It's downtown at the corner of two major streets, and it's surrounded in close proximity by other commercial buildings, and it is a busy pedestrian traffic as well in that area.
And Mr. Booker, are there domestic political reasons, first in Kenya, that might explain this, that you wouldn't have to look outside of Kenya?
I don't think so. There are certainly domestic political debates and political struggles going on in Kenya. And there are domestic forces that might be critical of U.S. policy toward Kenya, but there's no history of any of those critics having a violent attitude toward the U.S., its institutions. The same is even more true in Tanzania, which a much stronger tradition of peace and friendship with the United States and less controversy in the relations. I think at this point it's fairly safe to say that it's unlikely that the authors of these crimes were Kenyans or Tanzanians. And what's worrisome here is this may be a case of weak states being strong candidates of international terrorists seeking access to American targets.
Are these two countries particularly easy to get into? I mean, tourism is a big business for each of them. Is it fairly easy to enter the countries?
Well, Kenya is a bit of an international hub for East Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean. Its port of Mombasa and an international airport in Mombasa as well has a great deal of international traffic coming in and out to all parts of the world. It has porous borders with countries that themselves are facing degrees of conflict, including Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia. And of course the border between Kenya and Tanzania is fairly porous as well, and national park areas, etc. So I think that's, when I say weak states, part of what I mean is limits to a government's resources to commit to airport security, port security, border security, those types of efforts that do need strengthening.
Mr. McGeorge, why do you think these countries were chosen?
Because they were easy to get into in comparison to other places. Our embassies were readily accessible. They were not fortresses. The explosives are certainly available on the continent. They may have been brought in, but they certainly wouldn't have had to have been brought in.
You mean they could have been manufactured there?
Not necessarily manufactured, but Africa is full of explosives. There's no lack.
So they were brought in?
It's at some point possibly, though they could have been manufactured. The Egyptians manufacture explosives, various countries do. I think it's important to note that this bombing was not put together in the last 2 or 3 days, I don't think. Something of this sophistication as the operation, not the bomb, probably took a couple of months to do. Whatever the trigger event was, whether it was this Albanian, the deportation of these people, if that was the trigger event, then this bombing, the plan, preceded that.
Mr. Johnson, do you have anything to add about why Dar es Salaam and Nairobi?
It's the path of least resistance. Human nature with all international terrorist attacks, 99% of them, they go for the accessible target. And unfortunately, these embassies were not upgraded with the Diplomatic Security Act in 1985, where you move standoff. Because frankly, if there had been more distance from the street to these buildings, you would not have had the death toll, you would not have had the destruction. But what happened is people said it's a low threat area, so we're not going to spend a lot of money to build a new facility because we're not at risk. And what we've discovered is you can go from low threat to high threat in the instant that it takes for a bomb to go off.
Mr. Booker, any similar acts of terrorism that might give us any clues here in Kenya or in Tanzania?
Well, none in recent years, and certainly none aimed directly at American targets. Kenya experienced a bombing of the Norfolk Hotel years ago, related again to the Middle East conflict. But there's no history in these countries of not only terrorist attacks against U.S. targets, but any serious political attacks on U.S. policies or institutions in those countries.
Now, Mr. McGeorge, what happens next? What will investigators be looking for specifically?
The focus is going to be on who did it. At this stage, obviously we're taking care of casualties now, but investigators, who did it? And they're going to do that several different ways. One, they'll exploit all intelligence sources to see who might be perpetrated this. Secondly, they're going to look through every little scrap of rubble around there. It is extremely difficult to make bomb parts disappear. You may rip them apart, but they're still there. The FBI, ATF, and such are very clever at putting them back together again. That's what they'll be doing now. From that, a signature will emerge as to how the bomb was built.
Because people build bombs the same way over and over again?
Yes, they do. They find a way that works. It's really important for the bad guy, for the bomb to go off. They have a way that works reliably. They tend to stick to it. That creates a signature. And what they're going to be looking for is evidence of that signature, which will help lead us to possible suspects.
Anything to add?
What I would add to that is that there's a parallel policy track that needs to be followed. Dahran remains unsolved from
the Saudi Arabian
bomb. There's intelligence information that points a finger in the direction of Iran, and the Saudi government has not been cooperative. That needs to be pursued, because as long as Dahran remains unsolved, it leaves people with this impression you can bomb the United States and they don't retaliate, they let it go.
Mr. Booker, this is really devastating for Kenya and Tanzania, isn't it? I mean, their citizens are dead, gives them a dangerous image, and these are countries that rely on tourism to a great extent. This is a terrible thing for both of them, isn't it?
Right, very much so. And I think it demonstrates the need for international cooperation to combat international terrorism, and Africa being such an enormous continent with vulnerable states, vulnerable in the sense of being resource poor and having other national priorities before devoting resources to issues of combating international terrorism, represent a weak link in the international cooperation chain. And I think U.S. policy planners are going to have to reconsider their commitment of resources to working more with African governments to address this kind of problem. Certainly this attack, while aimed at American targets, was also indeed very anti-African. Whoever planned this was well aware that the vast majority of casualties would be African civilians working in or near American installations.
Well, thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.